There is a weight that settles into the chest of a woman who watches the bank account more closely than she watches the sunrise, who calculates grocery totals before reaching the register, who smiles when asked about provision, but lies awake rehearsing worst-case scenarios in the darkness. This weight does not announce itself as sin or failure, yet it shapes every decision, every prayer, every moment of supposed rest. The fear of financial instability in Christian homes is rarely loud enough to confess at a prayer meeting, but it is heavy enough to erode trust one anxious thought at a time. This fear does not emerge from greed or ingratitude. It grows from responsibility carried without relief, from watching others receive breakthrough, while personal reserves continue to shrink, from the exhausting work of holding everything together while pretending faith makes it effortless. Many women were taught to pray for patience and peace, but nobody explained how deeply spiritual the issue of provision truly becomes when tomorrow feels more threatening than the enemy himself. The home that should be a sanctuary becomes a place where faith is performed outwardly while worry negotiates terms inwardly. Scripture never condemns concern, but it relentlessly confronts fear that has replaced trust as the primary counselor. The issue is not weak faith, but misdirected responsibility. A slow surrender of peace to the tyranny of what-ifs that never actually arrive but always threaten to. This fear does not form through crisis alone. It accumulates through repeated moments of stretching resources just a little further, delaying personal needs one more month, choosing practicality over rest, watching everyone else seem provided for while emotional reserves quietly evaporate. Consider how water carried in a fragile vessel demands constant attention. There is no moment of true ease, no setting it down without consequence, no room for distraction without disaster. The mind stays alert, the body stays tense, the spirit stays divided between trust and survival. When the Israelites were given manna in the wilderness, the provision came with precise instructions that revealed divine intent. Gather only what is needed for today. Do not hoard for tomorrow. Those who tried to store extra found it rotting by morning. A clear message that provision was designed to train trust rather than eliminate effort. The design was relational, not transactional. God was teaching dependence, not independence. Yet the human instinct to control, to secure, to guarantee the future fights against this daily surrender. The question becomes uncomfortably clear when examined honestly. How often is tomorrow being rehearsed instead of entrusted? Within many Christian marriages, financial anxiety becomes a private burden rather than a shared altar. Scripture teaches unity and mutual submission, yet fear persuades the heart to carry weight alone in order to protect peace, avoid conflict, or prevent being seen as faithless. Martha offers a striking picture of this internal division. She loved Jesus, served him, welcomed him into her home, yet found herself exhausted and resentful, not because work was wrong, but because trust had been displaced by performance. Her complaint was not about laziness, but about feeling alone in responsibility while others seemed unburdened. Jesus did not rebuke her effort, but her anxious distraction, the fracturing of heart that occurs when service becomes separated from surrender. Many women recognize this fracture intimately. They work hard, manage well, keep the home running smoothly, yet feel increasingly distant from the peace they were promised. The weight is carried silently, because speaking it aloud feels like confession of failure, and failure feels too costly when provision already feels fragile. If this resonates deeply, if these words are landing somewhere tender, consider staying connected to this conversation. Subscribe, continue listening. Let this be a moment where nourishment is chosen over isolation, where the soul receives care instead of more pressure. There is a dangerous misconception embedded in much Christian teaching that suggests mature faith eliminates fear entirely. Many women believe that acknowledging anxiety equals spiritual failure, which creates suppression instead of healing, performance instead of transformation. Yet Scripture consistently addresses fear, not with condemnation, but with presence. God does not respond to human anxiety by demanding its immediate disappearance. Instead, He meets fear with relationship, with reminders of character, with invitations to remember past faithfulness. Provision is promised throughout Scripture, but timing is almost never specified. And this gap between promise and manifestation is where faith is actually formed. Standing on a bridge wrapped in thick fog requires stepping forward without visual confirmation of safety. The bridge exists, the structure is sound, but the evidence demanded by fear will not be provided until after the step is taken. Faith does not remove the fog. Faith steps into it based on the character of the one who built the bridge. Control often disguises itself as wisdom, as responsible stewardship, as practical thinking. Yet beneath the disguise, it is still fear attempting to secure outcomes that only God can guarantee. Provision has been reduced to a numerical equation in many Christian circles, measured solely by income and expenses, success and failure. Yet biblical provision is profoundly relational, expressed through endurance that should have broken, creativity that arrives precisely when needed, peace that defies circumstances, community that appears unexpectedly, and timing that makes sense only in retrospect. The widow of Zarephath had nothing left but a handful of flour and a little oil, enough for one final meal before starvation. Yet when she chose obedience over preservation, provision multiplied through the very act of surrender. Lack never disqualified her from divine care. Her faithfulness was not measured by how well she prevented collapse, but by how deeply she trusted in the middle of it. Many women exhaust themselves trying to prove they deserve provision by managing perfectly, by never asking for help, by keeping every plate spinning without complaint. Rest becomes equated with laziness, trust with irresponsibility, surrender with failure. The emotional cost is staggering, yet it is worn like a badge of devotion rather than recognized as misplaced burden. The human nervous system can be trained to stay alert even during prayer, even during rest, even during moments that should bring relief. Fear becomes a constant companion, a background hum that never fully quiets. Scripture speaks of a peace that guards the heart, but this peace is not dependent on circumstances aligning perfectly. It is a peace that stands in the middle of uncertainty and refuses to be moved by it. Imagine a watchman stationed on a city wall, eyes scanning the horizon, muscles tense, never stepping away from duty. This vigilance seems noble, even necessary, until the body begins to break under the strain of never resting. Burnout gets mistaken for devotion, exhaustion for faithfulness, collapse for spiritual warfare. The truth that must be faced, no matter how unsettling, is that fear may be exhausting faith more than circumstances ever could. The battle is not primarily financial but spiritual, not primarily external but internal, not primarily about provision but about trust. Take a moment here, not to act but to acknowledge. What has been carried silently for too long? What responsibility has been shouldered alone that was never meant to be borne in isolation? This pause is not weakness but wisdom, not avoidance but awareness. Restoration does not always arrive as sudden financial change. More often, it comes as internal realignment, as the slow rebuilding of trust that has atrophied under the weight of constant control. Trust functions like a muscle weakened by overuse of its opposite. When control has been the default response for years, Surrendering it feels dangerous, foolish, even irresponsible. Yet Scripture repeatedly emphasizes that God sustains, not merely provides. Provision can be withdrawn, stopped, changed, but sustaining speaks to ongoing relationship, to active involvement, to personal care that does not depend on human performance. David wrote that he had never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread, not because financial lack never touched believers, but because God's definition of forsaken differs radically from human fear. Being sustained through difficulty is not the same as being abandoned in it. Obedience begins to look different when fear no longer dictates every decision. Generosity becomes possible, rest becomes permissible, trust becomes primary. The shift is subtle but foundational, affecting not just financial decisions, but the entire posture of the heart. Something shifts when exhaustion is finally named for what it truly represents. The weariness is not just physical fatigue from managing a household or stretching limited resources. It runs deeper, settling into the bones like an infection that spreads slowly until every part of life feels heavy. This exhaustion emerges from the relentless mental calculation, the constant background processing of scenarios that might demand immediate response, the perpetual planning for disasters that exist only in imagination. The mind becomes a battlefield where peace is ambushed repeatedly by questions that have no answers, yet demand attention anyway. What if income drops unexpectedly? What if an emergency arrives before savings can recover? What if the car breaks down, the roof leaks, the medical bill arrives, the job ends, the support disappears? These questions multiply in darkness, breeding anxiety that feels rational, justified, even responsible. Yet there is something profoundly revealing about which thoughts dominate the inner landscape during moments that should belong to rest. When lying down to sleep, does the mind rehearse gratitude or catastrophe? When waking in the morning, does the heart reach first toward worship or worry? The answer exposes where allegiance has quietly shifted without conscious decision. Fear becomes functional, a tool used so consistently that its presence feels normal, even necessary. The absence of anxiety begins to feel like negligence, as though peace itself were a luxury that responsible women cannot afford. But this is the deception at its most subtle and most damaging. The lie that whispers trust equals carelessness, and surrender equals abandonment of duty. Paul wrote to the Philippians about anxiety with startling clarity, instructing them to be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, to make requests known to God. The promise attached was not financial security, but something far more valuable. Peace that surpasses understanding would guard hearts and minds. This peace does not make sense mathematically. It cannot be calculated or predicted. It defies the logic that says circumstances must change before emotions can settle. This peace arrives as gift rather than achievement, standing guard not over bank accounts but over the interior landscape where fear attempts to establish permanent residence. The command to avoid anxiety is not condemnation of those who struggle with it, but invitation into a different way of navigating uncertainty, a way that prioritizes relationship over control and presence over prediction. Consider how often the desire for financial security is actually desire for omniscience dressed in practical clothing. The wish to know that everything will work out, that every need will be met, that no disaster will strike unexpectedly, is ultimately a wish to see the future, to possess knowledge that belongs only to God. This desire feels reasonable because provision matters, because responsibility is real, because families depend on resources being managed well. Yet somewhere in the middle of legitimate concern, a line gets crossed. Stewardship becomes control. Planning becomes hoarding. Wisdom becomes worry. The shift happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the weight being carried feels crushing, and the peace that was promised feels impossibly distant. There is a story woven throughout Scripture about a God who deliberately chooses the insufficient to display his sufficiency. He calls a barren couple to become parents of nations. He selects a stammering murderer to confront Pharaoh. He anoints a shepherd boy to defeat a giant. He feeds thousands with a child's lunch. He builds a church through fishermen and tax collectors. He conquers death through crucifixion. The pattern is unmistakable and deeply intentional. Human insufficiency is not obstacle to divine purpose, but often the very stage upon which his character is most clearly revealed. Financial lack does not disqualify anyone from his care, nor does it indicate his absence or displeasure. Yet the shame attached to struggling financially within Christian communities often silences the very conversations that could bring healing, community, and perspective. The isolation intensifies the fear because struggling alone always feels more desperate than struggling together. When every other family seems stable, blessed, provided for, the assumption becomes that faith is somehow defective, prayers somehow inadequate, obedience somehow incomplete. But this comparison is built on curated exteriors that rarely reflect interior reality. Many homes that appear financially secure are also homes where anxiety runs rampant, where arguments about money create constant tension, where the appearance of stability costs more emotionally than anyone outside can see. The prosperity theology that promises financial blessing as evidence of spiritual favor has done immeasurable damage, creating shame around struggle and pride around success, neither of which reflect biblical truth about how God relates to his children. What would shift if provision were understood primarily as evidence of relationship rather than reward for performance? If resources were seen as tools entrusted rather than achievements earned? If lack were viewed as opportunity for dependence rather than punishment for inadequacy? The entire emotional landscape would transform, not because circumstances changed, but because the framework for interpreting them shifted completely. Elijah experienced miraculous provision through ravens bringing food, then through a widow's multiplying oil, then through an angel's meal that sustained him for 40 days. Each method was different. Each timing was unexpected. Each provision was sufficient but never excessive. He was never given enough to stop depending, never supplied so abundantly that trust became unnecessary, never provided for so far in advance that tomorrow could be secured today. The pattern reveals divine intent that provision and relationship remain inseparably connected. Fear will not disappear simply because it has been named or confronted. It may remain as a whisper, as an old habit, as a familiar voice that tries to reclaim authority. The goal is not elimination, but reordering. Faith matures not when fear disappears, but when it no longer leads, when it no longer makes decisions, when it no longer determines worth or dictates direction. Provision must be returned to its rightful place, not as a test to pass or a metric to achieve, but as a relationship to deepen. The Father who clothes the lilies and feeds the sparrows is the same Father who sees the anxiety etched into tired faces and the calculations running constantly through weary minds. He is not distant, not disappointed, not withholding. He is present, patient, and deeply committed to teaching trust in a world that worships control. The invitation is not to pretend the fear is gone or to deny the very real challenges of managing a household with limited resources. The invitation is to stop carrying what was never meant to be carried alone, to recognize that vigilance is not the same as faithfulness, to understand that rest is obedience rather than indulgence. Provision is promised, but the promise includes process, partnership, and presence rather than immediate resolution. Faith stands in the tension between promise and manifestation, without demanding the gap be closed on human terms. This standing is not passive waiting, but active trust. Not denial of difficulty, but refusal to let difficulty define identity or dictate allegiance. The woman who learns to entrust rather than control, to depend rather than manage alone, to trust the character of God more than the contents of her bank account, discovers something far more valuable than financial security. She discovers peace that cannot be stolen by circumstances, hope that does not fluctuate with income, and rest that no amount of money could ever purchase. This is the provision that truly sustains, the gift that transforms not just finances, but the entire posture of a heart learning to receive, rather than constantly strive to secure what has already been promised by a Father who never fails.